Welcome to this Masterclass explainer on respiratory physiology. If you're a medical or health science student prepping for your PHS 222 exams, you are in exactly the right place. Today, we're not just going to sit here and memorize dry facts. No, we're going to systematically build your understanding of pulmonary volumes and ventilation dynamics, layer by layer. We'll be breaking down the science exactly how your lecturers expect it, so you can walk into those MCQs, essays, and clinical ward rounds with absolute confidence. Let's get started.
We're going to tackle this topic across 5 quick sections today. 1. Primary volumes and capacities. 2. Spirometry and diagnostic biophysics. 3. Dead space and wasted ventilation. 4. Pulmonary versus alveolar ventilation. And finally, 5. A high-yield exam review.
Starting right off with Section 1, Primary Volumes and Capacities.
Okay, so let's establish our foundation. Before we can even touch on complex respiratory diseases, we absolutely have to understand the basic architecture of a single breath. The human lung is basically an elastic chamber, and it's divided into 4 primary, non-overlapping physical volumes. We'll start with tidal volume. This is the 500 milliliters of air moving in and out during just a normal, quiet, resting breath. You can think of this as your baseline. But your lungs actually have a massive capacity for way more than that, and that brings us to the Inspiratory Reserve Volume. This is an extra 3,000 milliliters of air that you can forcefully breathe in over and above your normal tidal breath. It's essentially your metabolic reserve, and you really only recruit it during heavy physical exertion.
Now, on the flip side of that, we have the Expiratory Reserve Volume. This is the extra 1,100 milliliters of air that you can actively push out of your lungs using your abdominal muscles right after a normal expiration. And finally, we have the Residual Volume, which sits at roughly 1,200 milliliters. Now listen closely here, because this is a biophysical necessity. You literally can never voluntarily expel this volume. It has to stay in your lungs to prevent the alveoli from completely collapsing, and it provides this continuous reservoir for gas exchange even while you are actively breathing out.
What's really cool about this concept is that there's a perfect local analogy to help you intuitively grasp it. Think of the residual volume as the priming water that just has to remain inside a manual borehole hand pump. You know, like the ones you might see in Uyo. If you pump one of those boreholes completely dry, the internal suction leather cup shrinks and totally loses its seal. To get it working again, you actually have to pour in a cup of priming water. Well, your residual volume is exactly that. It's the permanent priming water in your chest. It keeps the alveoli slightly open so you don't have to exhaust your respiratory muscles trying to pop open collapsed lungs with every single breath.
Now notice how those 4 primary volumes stack together to form what we call diagnostic capacities. A capacity is really just 2 or more volumes combined. See how tidal volume and inspiratory reserve volume combine to make the inspiratory capacity? Or look at how all the volumes you can actively move combine into your vital capacity, which sits at about 4,600 milliliters. Finally, if you add in that unmeasurable residual volume, you get your total lung capacity of 5,800 milliliters. Lecturers absolutely love to test this layout, so for sure, make sure you can visualize all these compartments.
Moving on to Section 2, Spirometry and Diagnostic Biophysics. So now that we know the compartments themselves, let's explore how we actually measure these invisible volumes in a real clinical setting. And here's a common examination trap for you. A standard spirometer only records the volume of air moving into and out of the mouth over time. So why can't it measure total lung capacity? Well, it's because of the Spirometry Limitation Rule. A spirometer can only measure air that is actively moved. Since you can never voluntarily expire your residual volume, a standard spirometer can never directly measure the residual volume, the functional residual capacity, or the total lung capacity.
To bypass this physical limitation, clinicians use some really clever workarounds. The first one is the helium dilution method. It relies on a very basic principle of physics, the conservation of mass. The protocol is pretty elegant, actually. A patient breathes normally, and right at the end of a normal expiration, when their lung volume equals exactly the functional residual capacity, they're switched over to a closed spirometer circuit. This circuit contains a known volume and concentration of inert helium gas. They breathe, the helium mixes in their lungs, and then we just measure the final diluted concentration.
This closed-circuit method is honestly just like diluting palm oil. Imagine you have a small cup of water that's highly concentrated with intense red palm oil. If you pour that cup into a massive pot of clean water of an unknown volume, mix it all up thoroughly, and then measure exactly how pale the red color has become, you can calculate the exact volume of water in that pot. The helium dilution method does exactly this, just inside the lungs, to calculate that hidden functional residual capacity. So an absolutely crucial point to remember for your multiple choice questions is the difference between our two diagnostic methods. Helium dilution relies on the conservation of mass, but it only measures gas that actually communicates with active airways. Body plethysmography, sometimes called the body box, uses Boyle's law instead. The patient breathes against a closed shutter, and by measuring tiny pressure changes inside the box, we can calculate all the gas in the chest. That includes even the air trapped behind obstructed airways in diseases like emphysema.
Section 3. Dead space and wasted ventilation.
Moving to our third layer, we have to face a somewhat harsh biological reality. Not all the air you breathe actually keeps you alive. We need to talk about wasted ventilation. You're going to want to memorize the breakdown here, as it's totally foundational. Anatomic dead space is the volume of your conducting airways, like your trachea and bronchi, where the physical walls are just too thick for gas exchange. This is normally about 150 milliliters. Alveolar dead space is air that actually reaches the alveoli, but those specific alveoli are damaged or they lack blood flow, so no exchange happens anyway. Now, in a healthy person, this is virtually zero. Finally, physiological dead space is just the sum of both. It represents your total overall wasted ventilation.
To really visualize anatomic dead space, think back to drawing water from a deep borehole through a very long pipe. Every single time you pump, the first volume of water that comes out is just the stagnant water that was sitting right there in the pipe. It never reaches your bucket as fresh water. Your conducting airways are exactly like that long pipe, constantly trapping 150 milliliters of air with every single breath you take.
Section 4. Pulmonary versus alveolar ventilation.
This brings us to a really crucial clinical distinction that lecturers want to make sure you deeply, deeply understand: the total air moved versus the actual fresh air participating in gas exchange. Looking at the formulas, minute ventilation simply multiplies your tidal volume by your respiratory rate. It tells us how much total air is moving. But here's the thing: the clinical priority is always the alveolar ventilation. Notice how the formula changes. We subtract the dead space from the tidal volume before we multiply by the respiratory rate. This formula reveals the true volume of fresh air that's actually reaching the gas exchange zones.
Let's apply this clinically to put it into perspective. Imagine a patient in respiratory distress taking rapid, really shallow breaths, let's say a tidal volume of just 200 milliliters at 40 breaths a minute. On paper, their minute ventilation looks great at 8 liters per minute, but when you actually calculate their alveolar ventilation by subtracting that 150 milliliter dead space, it plummets to a dangerously hypoxic 2.0 liters per minute.
The distribution of inspired air here perfectly maps to what I like to call the empty kike on Ikot-Egpene Road. Imagine a kike driver speeding wildly back and forth between two very close gates on Ikot-Egpene Road. He's burning fuel rapidly, which is your high-minute ventilation, but because the distance is so incredibly short, he never actually reaches the main bus station to drop off his passengers. So, his alveolar ventilation is zero. In rapid, shallow breathing, you are literally just wasting energy moving air back and forth in the anatomic dead space without ever delivering oxygen to the alveoli.
Finally, Section 5. High-yield exam review.
Let's consolidate this whole masterclass with a rapid-fire review of the calculations your lecturers absolutely favor. Go ahead and grab a mental pen and paper. Here's a classic volume calculation. You are given the vital capacity, tidal volume, and inspiratory reserve volume, and you're asked to find the expiratory reserve volume. Just remember the formula. Vital capacity equals TV plus IRV plus ERV. By simply subtracting the 500 milliliter tidal volume and the 2900 milliliter inspiratory reserve volume from the total 4500 milliliter vital capacity, we find the expiratory reserve volume is exactly 1100 milliliters. Boom. Simple.
Okay, next up, a helium dilution calculation. The spirometer volume is 3.2 liters, the initial helium concentration is 12%, and the final equilibrated concentration is 7.5%. Applying the standard dilution formula, we take the spirometer volume and multiply it by the ratio of the concentration difference over the final concentration. Doing that math, 3.2 liters multiplied by 0.6 yields a functional residual capacity of exactly 1.92 liters or 1920 milliliters. Step-by-step logic wins every single time here.
Now what about an athlete under heavy exertion? With a massive tidal volume of 2.0 liters and breathing at 35 breaths per minute, their minute ventilation hits an incredible 70 liters per minute. But remember our clinical priority, true alveolar ventilation. We absolutely must subtract the 150 milliliter anatomic dead space from every single one of those 35 breaths. When we do that, we find that true alveolar ventilation is 64.75 liters per minute. Still huge, but mathematically precise.
Finally, keep an eye out for this classic essay topic, the pathophysiology of emphysema. In emphysema, the alveolar walls are quite literally destroyed, creating these large air spaces that lack capillary blood flow. This means fresh air enters, sure, but no gas exchange occurs. Therefore, even though the physical volume of the anatomic dead space remains totally unchanged, the physiological dead space increases dramatically because of that massive alveolar dead space.
We have covered immense ground today, all the way from the basic biophysics of the residual volume right through to the life-saving mathematics of alveolar ventilation. So, as you prepare for your exams, I want to leave you with this one provocative thought. Deep, slow breathing is fundamentally, mathematically far more efficient than rapid, shallow breaths. So how will you use this biophysical reality to identify a patient suffering from hidden hypoxia on your very next clinical ward round? Keep reviewing, keep connecting those concepts, and I'll see you in the next explainer.